Hi, so today we're going to demo some of the new features for the Machinist web app in release number 2. There are a few new features that we can show in the web app to start with. One of the new features we added was the ability to expand and scroll this canvas area. So the way that the app works is you have this canvas that you can create nodes on. When you generate nodes, the new feature is that you can now grab these nodes and drag them towards the edge of the screen to expand your canvas size. And this canvas is now scrollable and larger than it was before. We can demonstrate what it looks like if we have a transition connected. So what this is going to let us do is create much larger state machine graphs than we previously were able to. Another new feature that we've implemented in the UI is global styling and fonts that we determined in our UI design from release number 1. So in release number 1, we chose a font called Inter. So we've now applied that font globally across the entire site. On top of that, we've styled the transitions so that they are a little bit more noticeable. What I will say about the transitions is, one of our goals in release number 2 was to make these transitions a lot nicer than they look right now, actually. So this represents some issues that we were not able to complete in this release, because what really should be represented here is an arrow. And not just an arrow, but these transitions should be able to arc in smooth lines. We still have only straight lines, but we've thickened up the transitions a bit at the same time as we've applied some extra global styling. Continuing with Machinist web app, we're going to jump on the live environment and we'll demo a feature that wasn't present in release number 1. And that was that in the first release, we had created this run inputs dialog, but there was no backend deployed for our system. So all you had was the Machinist web app, and we had a Kubernetes cluster for our backend, but there weren't any services deployed on it. So you weren't actually able to run inputs. So one of the major features that we added in release 2, which actually took quite a bit of development time, was to properly set up the Kubernetes cluster, all the resources we need on Amazon for that, to set up CI/CD pipelines that deploy the simulator service to the cluster. So now in release number 2, we have a simulator service live in our environment. We can test it out by making a small machine. We'll make a brief machine here that just accepts any string of A's. So we'll make a transition self loop, and again the UI is not present to actually render this as a loop, but this little node here is a self loop. We'll make this a start state and end state, and we'll give that transition an A symbol. If we open the run inputs dialog, we can then pass in a string and submit this form, and this will connect to a real simulator service that's running on the Kubernetes cluster. Now, this is a very minor demo, and ideally there will be a lot more complex features to running inputs. For example, we're planning on supporting the ability to step through the execution of an input. But still, we've made progress on deploying a simulator service, and by creating this infrastructure around Kubernetes, we now are able to develop more services that we can deploy on the cluster. The other major feature that we added in release number 2 is support for a WebSockets endpoint on the simulator service. Now, this version of the simulator we haven't deployed yet on the Kubernetes cluster. Another thing that's not complete is connecting our front-end app to this WebSockets endpoint. Because what we want to do is a lot of the communication, because the app is so interactive, we would need to be making a lot of many HTTP requests. For example, to support a feature like stepping through the execution of an input string, we would need possibly dozens of HTTP requests just to step through a fairly small state machine. And the longer the input string gets, the more requests that it would need to be executed. So one of the re-architectures that we did in release number 2 was to design a WebSocket endpoint. The WebSocket endpoint is going to allow the front end to make a larger number of requests, and it will also allow us to send notifications from the back end to all the front end clients that are connected to the service. So we've created a small demo for the WebSocket endpoint. It's functional in the simulator service, but it's not yet deployed and it's not connected to the front end. So what we're going to do is we'll spin up our service locally here. And right now we're on the WebSockets branch, which is going to be merged any moment now after we're done recording. So we've spun up the server, and with this demo HTML page, we can connect to that WebSockets endpoint. We can send some messages to our server. Currently, we've implemented 3 different APIs on the WebSocket endpoint. What I'll do is I'll copy some JSON message from my editor here, and I'll send it to the WebSocket endpoint through this demo application that we made. So what we're sending here is some JSON that specifies a state machine in its payload. It has a tape input parameter, and it provides an operation that we want to execute on the service. When we send this, we see that the WebSocket responds with a message containing the result of our simulation. So this is the so-called do endpoint, which runs a simulation to completion. We can also start simulations and have them kept track of on the simulator service. This is another API that's implemented on the WebSocket endpoint. We can send it some state machine with a tape, and it will start the simulation, but it won't step through. This is the API that will be used to support step-through execution in the future. After we've started a simulation, we can try ending the simulation with another operation. So, although it's brief and fairly small, this demo shows we have got the WebSocket endpoint working, and we will be able to build features on top of this endpoint for the future, for future releases. That's what we have to show for release number 2 for Machinist project.